new a phenomenon. This began maybe 1,000 years with the heroic efforts of certain great tzaddikim to get to Israel, and more came until by the 1500s there were sizable communities in Eretz Israel. The Yishuv was growing, and in the centuries thereafter, and it was constantly increasing in momentum. And we've seen in the last 500 years, particularly since the expulsion from Spain, the great, steadily, exponentially increasing influx into Eretz Israel until, particularly since the last 120, 130 years, we have what we have today, where practically at least half of identifying Jews in the world are now in Israel, and possibly more, where the balance of the Jewish people and the center has come back to be Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And one of the things that we see if we look at the sweep of history, that the more Jews coming into the land, the more the land and the right of the Jew to the land has been contested by the nations. This is a feature of history, that the more Jews that have come to the land, the more the right of the Jews to the land has been called into question. I'd like to share with you a masorah that was brought down by students of the outstanding Torah sage of the last century, Rabbi Yisrael Kagan, the Chofetz Chaim. Chofetz Chaim lived a very long life, fit with his special teaching to abstain from Lashon Hara in order to gain life, and he was blessed with many years, and he left the world in 1935, which was 2 years after the Nazis came to power in Germany, and just 4 years before the outbreak of the Second World War. Well, in a biography of Chofetz Chaim by one of his closest students, he writes there that Chofetz Chaim commented that the war of Gog and Magog is in 3 stages, and that the first stage had already taken place. The second stage was about to take place, and there will be a third stage after that. But if we look back through the eyes of somebody in the 1930s, looking back to see what was the most cataclysmic event in the world in the last decade, it was clearly the First World War. And the First World War was accompanied by the revolution in Russia and by the civil wars in Russia, which led actually to the destruction of at least 1 million Jews, besides the colossal losses of life in the First World War and all the battles and so on, many millions of people. But for the Jewish people, it was a catastrophe, not quite numerically on the scale of the Holocaust, but an absolute catastrophe. And yet, we see that out of the First World War, there came about what was seen by many of the tzaddikim of the time, including Chofetz Chaim, a great salvation, which was the declaration by the British government in 1917, recognizing the land of Palestine as the place for a Jewish homeland. We see, in fact, that as part of the First World War, the advance of the Germans into Palestine was prevented by General Allenby, and clearly, looking with hindsight after what happened later and the role of Germany practically as an Amalek to the Jewish people in the Nazi era, the very fact that Germany was not able to conquer Eretz Israel neither in the First World War nor in the Second World War was a tremendous Yeshua in itself for the Jewish people. And then the Balfour Declaration, acknowledging the rights of the Jewish people to a homeland in Palestine, was itself a breakthrough. In the Holy Zohar, in the numerous places where the Zohar speaks about the redemption and the revelation of Moshiach, we find that Moshiach appears and then promptly disappears. That the light of Moshiach is visible in the world for a time, and then darkness and concealment. And so it was after the Balfour Declaration that what the British gave with one hand, they promptly took away with the other hand. In 1917, there was no such thing as a Palestinian people. The name Palestine was put upon the lands of Judea by the Romans as the crowning insult to Judea after the destruction of Jewish independence after the revolt against the Romans. The Romans knew that the traditional nemesis of the Jews in Israel were the Philistines, and they transliterated the word Philistine into Latin as Palestine, and they called the land Palestine as a deliberate affront to the Jews, to rub it in the bitter word that Judea kapta est, Judea has been captured. And in 1917, if you thought about Palestine, it went from the east coast of the Mediterranean right across the little strip that is present-day Medinat Israel, right across the west bank of the Jordan, right across the Jordan, far to the east of the Jordan, into what is today the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. All of that was Palestine. So was the Golan, Palestine, areas of Syria were all in 1917 in the political lexicon of that time, unquestionably Palestine. Today, if somebody gets up and he says he supports Palestine, he is thought to be supporting the Arab nationalists who call themselves Palestinians. But when I was a kid growing up in Britain, the name of the Israel Bonds was the Joint Palestine Appeal, because the Jews understood that Palestine was the place for the Jewish homeland. Well, in the 1920s, the British wanted to make order in the Middle East and saw the need to set up a kingdom in Saudi Arabia to be in control of all of the oil interests, etc., etc. And another Arab ruling clan were very upset by the choice of the present royal family in Saudi Arabia as the rulers of Saudi Arabia. So in order to compensate them, the British chopped off part of what they had offered to the Jews as the homeland and said, this is going to be the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. And so it is that the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan came into being, occupying lands that, according to all of the prophets, are destined to return to Israel at the end of days. And this certainly gives the king of Jordan a very strong incentive to try to keep Israel small and in its place, to hold up the establishment of the prophecies just as long as possible. Now, as I said, we can see from the prophecy of Ezekiel that this war takes place when Israel have returned to the land. We have learned from the outstanding sage of the present era, the Chofetz Chaim, that although the prophet speaks about an event which has a whole scenario and both in Ezekiel and in Zechariah chapter 14, a very vivid picture of armies and a battle. But we learn from Chofetz Chaim that this is not a 3-hour Hollywood movie, but this is a lengthy historical process. And that the nations that are attacking Israel are representatives of the nations that are mentioned in our text, but the attacks on Israel may go from generation to generation. Ever since the destruction of the Second Temple and the exile from Israel, the Jews in exile knew only persecution, discrimination, far too frequent pogroms and atrocities. And we can also see that some of the most colossal atrocities were committed in the last couple of hundred years.